to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. On Snoozecast, we read excerpts from public domain works and, occasionally, original stories. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on social media and wherever you listen to podcasts. We'd like to thank our listeners. If you enjoy our show, please write us a review. Also, share it with a friend. This episode is brought to you by Melatonin. Tonight, for our 100th episode, we'll be reading Rip Van Winkle, a story found in Mrs. Lang's 1913 The Strange Storybook. Rip Van Winkle was originally a short story by the American author Washington Irving, published in 1819. It follows a Dutch-American villager in colonial America named Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep in the Catskill Mountains and wakes up 20 years later, having missed the American Revolution. Irving wrote it while living in England, and later admitted he had never been to the Catskill Mountains when he wrote the story. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Rip Van Winkle. West of the River Hudson, and at the foot of the Catskill Mountains, lies one of the oldest European villages in the United States of America. It was built by some of the earliest Dutch settlers, who were so anxious to have everything nice and tidy as it would have been at home, that they brought a large supply of bricks and weathercocks from Holland to make it. And you would never have guessed from the look of the houses that you were in the New World. In course of time, the snows of winter and the heats of summer began to leave their mark on the surface of the bricks, and the cottages that were not well cared for showed signs of wear and tear. In one of the shabbiest of them there dwelt, while New York was still a British colony, a descendant of one of the old fighters, called Rip Van Winkle. Rip was one of those delightful people who are never too busy to listen to your troubles or to sympathize with your grievances. And if you were short-handed in the hayfield or had no one to grind the corn, you might always count on him. But if men and women loved him, children adored him. He made the best toys, flew kites when there really seemed no breeze to lift them from the ground, and bowled over a larger number of ninepins than the cleverest of them all. As he passed through the fields or the village street, the children ran out of the houses and gathered about him, till you might have thought that the days of the Pied Piper of Hamelin had come back. And if a child was ill, or a snowstorm heavier than usual was raging, there would be a knock at the door, and Rip's cheerful pink face would enter, with tales of ghosts and witches and Indians, which, like all the very nicest things, were a joy and a terror in one. Yet, for some reason which few persons, and certainly none of the children could understand. Rip's wife did not seem to appreciate him as highly as his friends did. When he came home in the evening and was burning to tell her how he had spent all day sitting on a wet rock above a splendid pool in the river, and how very cleverly he had caught all sorts of big fish, she would point to some logs which needed splitting for the kitchen fire. When he began to relate how the gale of last night had blown down Farmer Galpin's stone wall, and that it had taken both of them all the morning and afternoon to set it up again, she would ask him how it was he had never perceived the gap in his own fence. And if she inquired why the plums in the orchard had not been gathered, but had fallen rotting to the ground, she did not seem content with his answer that Goodwife Barker had run out of thread and could not go on with her spinning till he fetched her a supply. "Everyone's business but your own," she replied bitterly, to which Rip, though he never got cross, would murmur with a downcast face that his farm was the worst bit of land in the country and would grow nothing but weeds. And that, of course, he could not have guessed that the cow which was feeding at the other end of the field would have spied the hole in the hedge and have eaten all the cabbages in the garden. And if he ever planted any seed, the rain was sure to wash it out of the ground before he had time to let it take root. Now, it must be admitted that Mrs. Van Winkle had some grounds for complaint, for though she did nothing but grumble, she worked hard to feed the children, not thinking it necessary, however, to mend their clothes. They were the oddest sights in the cast-off garments of their father and mother, or of anyone who took pity on their ragged condition. And the oddest of all was young Rip, whose coat-tails, if not held well up or pinned across him in front, trailed on the ground behind him like a lady's train. Still the children were, in spite of the drawbacks, as happy as kings. They did not want to be made clean and tidy, and they were so used to hearing their mother scolding all the day long, that they would have quite missed the sound of her tongue if it had ever stopped. But there was no danger of that. Except Rip, the only person who minded Mrs. Van Winkle's ill temper was Rip's inseparable companion, his dog, Wolf. As soon as he entered the house, his tail, instead of being carried proudly in the air, fell between his legs, and far from jumping about and putting his muddy paws on your knees as a happy dog always does, he would sneak into the darkest corner and try to escape notice. As the years went by, things grew worse and not better. Rip spent less and less time at home, and was generally to be found sitting on a bench in front of the inn, telling some of his old stories, or discussing with other idle men the actions of the government, of which none of them knew anything, and which generally were over and done with weeks before. These gatherings were presided over by Nicholas Vedder, the landlord, who said little, but smoked his pipe and looked wise. For a while, Rip was left in peace and enjoyed himself. Then one day his wife broke in upon this peaceable company and scolded them for their idleness till they all fled in different directions. After that, Rip went there no more, but whistled to Wolf, and, taking down his gun, went up into the mountains. On a fine autumn morning, the two friends went off as usual and climbed to one of the highest peaks of the Catskills. At length, quite exhausted, Rip threw himself down on a green knoll almost on top of a cliff, watching the sun sinking slowly in the west. The Hudson River, bounded with woods, could be seen on one side of him. A deep, stony glen was on the other, and all about him the stillness seemed in itself to bring rest and peace. But the lengthening shadows gave him warning that he must retrace his steps at once, unless he wished to be barred out of his house, and heavily he rose to his feet and whistled to Wolf when he heard a voice crying, "Rip Van Winkle!" He looked round with a start, but as he saw nothing but a crow flying home to bed, he thought his ears must have deceived him. He turned again to the path, when a second time the cry sounded, "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" And at the same instant Wolf gave a howl, and his hair stood up as if something terrible was in the neighborhood. Rip followed the direction of the dog's eyes, which were fixed with an expression of fear on the glen, and Rip, with a sinking of heart that he could not explain, beheld a shadowy figure toiling towards them through the rocks, weighed down by something heavy, which it carried on its back. "Poor old fellow, he can hardly get along. I'd better go and help him," thought Rip, and set off down the path. But when he came near to the stranger, he stopped in surprise, for never had he beheld anyone so odd. The man was old and short and square, with a shock of thick, bushy hair and a long grayish beard. He was dressed after the Dutch fashion of 100 years back, in a jacket belted round the waist, and several pairs of breeches, each a little longer than the other. On his shoulder was a keg of liquor, nearly as big as himself. "Let me take that for a bit," said Rip, and though the dwarf did not understand his words, there was no mistaking the meaning of Rip's outstretched hands. So, carrying the keg by turns, they clambered upwards, apparently along the bed of a mountain stream, while thunder rolled about them. Now, of course, thunder in mountains is common enough. But what was uncommon about this thunder was that besides coming from above them, it seemed to issue from a narrow cleft of the rock in front of them, where the path ended. When they reached the ravine, the dwarf led the way through the cleft and signed to his companion to follow, for they could not walk abreast. Once through the cleft, Rip found himself in a round, hollow place, enclosed by precipices, overhung by trees, so that it would be completely concealed from anyone walking on the mountain. The branches and the leaves were so thick that even the bright rays of the setting sun could hardly pierce through them. At the entrance to the hollow, Rip paused again, for before him was a group of little men playing ninepins. Like his guide, they wore jerkins and breeches, and knives were stuck in their belts. They were all very ugly, with long beards and large noses, and one, who appeared the leader, had a high-crowned hat with a feather and high-heeled shoes with roses on them, very unfit, thought Rip, for climbing about those rough paths. As Rip and his companion came out from the cleft, the little men suddenly stopped their game, which they had played in dead silence, and without seeming in the least to enjoy it. They turned and looked at the stranger, and Rip felt his blood run cold and his knees knock together. Why, he could not have told, except that their faces had a strange, fixed expression, such as he had never seen on the face of any living being. But no time was allowed him to indulge in these thoughts, for his companion signed to him to fill some big flagons which stood on one side from the keg they had carried. When the players had emptied the flagons, they went back to their game, seeming as melancholy as before. After a while, Rip began to grow a little less frightened, and he even ventured, when no one was observing him, to take a good draught out of the keg himself. As soon as he had done so, his eyes and head became very heavy, and he fell down where he stood, sunk in a deep sleep. It was bright and sunny when Rip woke, lying curled up comfortably on the green knoll from which he had first beheld the old man climbing up the path. The birds were twittering in the bushes and hopping round him, and high up over the tops of the mountains, an eagle was soaring. "Have I really slept here all night?" he said to himself. "Oh dear, how angry my wife will be." Then he sat up, and there rushed into his mind the cleft in the rocks and the little men playing ninepins. "It was the flagon which was my undoing," said he. Scrambling to his feet, he looked about for his gun, but in place of the well-kept weapon with its shining barrel, the only thing on which Rip ever bestowed any care, he saw an old rusty firelock with the wooden stalk eaten by worms and falling away. "Why, they have been playing tricks on me and changed my gun," he exclaimed, though they did look so solemn. "But what has become of Wolf? Gone after a squirrel, I suppose." and he whistled loudly to call him back. But whistle as Rip might, for the first time he heard no bark in answer. Oh well, he'll come home when he's tired. I'll go back to that curious place and tell them I must have my own gun. But as Rip moved to climb the path, he felt his legs stiff and was obliged to go slowly. These mountain roads don't agree with me, he thought. I mustn't be caught in this way a second time. And with great difficulty, he made his way to the gully. But since he saw it last, the face of the glen had altered completely. Instead of the dried-up watercourse through which he and the dwarf had painfully clambered, a torrent was now dashing itself from rock to rock, so that Rip was obliged to take a roundabout path through the mass of shrubs and creepers that clothed the sides of the ravine. Pushing and fighting, he at length reached the spot where the cleft led to the hollow in the rocks. But what a change from the evening before! The opening had entirely vanished, and a high waterfall leapt from above it into a round basin. Surely this was the place. Yes, I'm certain of it, cried the bewildered Rip. And again he tried to call to Wolf, but his voice died away in his throat. Well, I can't starve among the mountains, whatever happens, he said, with a show of briskness which would not have deceived anybody, if anybody but himself had been there to see. And taking up the old rusty gun, he began to go down the mountain. As he drew near the village, he met several people and was surprised to find they were all strangers to him. Where can they all have come from? And who can they be? He said. I didn't think there could be 3 people for miles round, unknown to me. What queer dresses they have on, too. Can they be a crew of foreigners, shipwrecked in the Sound, who have strayed up here? If they are, they've been pretty quick about it. And really, he thought, as he glanced back over his shoulder and noticed them staring at him, they seem to find me as odd as I find them. And why do they all stroke their chins as they look at me? Is anything the matter with my chin? And as he put his hand up to feel it, he discovered that he had grown a beard a foot long. By this time, he had entered the village street, and a group of children gathered at his heels. At that, his eyes brightened, and his face lost something of its half-puzzled, half-frightened expression. Here, at least, was something to which he was accustomed. But instead of the smiles and shouts of joy which formerly greeted him, these children hooted rudely and pointed to his beard. Then indeed Rip's heart began to fail within him. What was the matter that in one night everything had changed so, and nothing seemed as it was only yesterday? And now he came to think of it. After a single night, the village appeared much bigger, and the fields that were green when he went up the mountain were full of houses today. Even the very dogs did not know him, and perhaps that was worst of all. I am bewitched, thought Rip. It can't all be that flagon. He turned to go to his own house, but the very road to it was altered, and he lost his way more than once. At last he struck into a path which he recognized, and he stopped for a moment, expecting to hear his wife's voice scolding somebody. But all was still, and as he drew nearer, he saw that the roof had fallen in, and the glass of the windows was broken. A half-starved dog was prowling round, and with a throb of joy, Rip whistled and called to him, "Wolf, Wolf, come here, good dog." But the dog snarled and showed his teeth before trotting away. Was it Wolf or not? Rip never knew. Inside the house was as desolate as without, and very unlike to what Rip had been accustomed to see it. Though he felt it was useless, he shouted the names of his wife and children. Then a thrill of fear passed over him, and not daring to look behind him, he hurried